In the land once blanketed with cotton fields, a new battle is being fought, not with guns, but with genes. When Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré, ordered the destruction of genetically modified mosquitoes, funded by billion-dollar Western foundations, he didn't just kill a project. He ignited a firestorm of memory. From genetically altered seeds to sterilization scandals, Africa has seen science arrive with promises, only to leave with sovereignty. The mosquitoes were meant to fight malaria, but to many, they symbolized something more insidious. Experiments on African soil, approved abroad, tested at home. And when these creatures took flight, so did questions about power, trust, and who decides the future of the continent. Do not look away. What unfolds is not just policy, it is a stand for sovereignty. Subscribe and witness this turning point in African history. If a single batch of engineered insects can trigger such fury, what else lies buried in Africa's scientific past? And what does it mean when one president says, "Enough"? On 11th August, the skies over Burkina Faso witnessed something extraordinary. Not a drone, not a storm, but a quiet release of engineered life. A small batch of genetically modified male mosquitoes, created to suppress malaria, were let loose above unsuspecting villages. Less than a week later, President Ibrahim Traoré issued an uncompromising directive. Stop everything. Labs dismantled. Samples destroyed. Field tests aborted. This was no minor policy reversal. This was a rupture. The project in question? Target Malaria, a multi-decade, multi-million-dollar initiative bankrolled by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Over $150 million. Open philanthropy, $17 million, and spearheaded by Imperial College London. Its stated mission? Eradicate malaria by re-engineering the very species that spreads it, Anopheles coluzi. By editing its DNA to produce predominantly male offspring, since only females bite, scientists aimed to shrink populations and curb disease. On paper, the science looked clean, clever, clinical. But on African soil, it struck a different nerve. Because beneath the petri dishes and white coats lies a history of deep scars. History where experiments bore African names, where the promise of innovation often arrived hand in hand with exploitation. And this time, the most sensitive of ecosystems, the genetic blueprint of life itself, was being altered, and once released, could never be recalled. Burkina Faso wasn't chosen by accident. As one of the first African countries to approve genetically modified organisms, GMOs, it had become a hub of experimental agriculture and health tech. Its institutions, biosafety agencies, research ethics boards, had all greenlit the mosquito trials. Permits were issued, community meetings were held, but approval isn't understanding, and consent isn't clarity. What angered many was not just what was done, but where it was done. The DNA edits, performed in high-end labs in London, not Ouagadougou. The patents, filed and owned by institutions in the global north. African scientists were tasked with releasing, observing, and managing, but they had no control over the core technology. This is not partnership. This is outsourcing risk, critics said. And they had reason to worry, because Burkina Faso had seen this script before. In its cotton fields, where genetically modified Bt cotton, introduced with grand promises of pest resistance and economic boom, ended in disaster. Quality declined. Global buyers pulled out. By 2016, the entire cotton industry, the pride of the nation, had collapsed under the weight of innovation. Now, mosquitoes were the new frontier, and Traoré said no. But this wasn't just about malaria, or mosquitoes, or even Monsanto-style agriculture. It was about memory, and the fear that Africa was once again being cast as the world's testing ground, where technology too risky, too untested, too unknown for Western cities was being deployed on rural villages, where the continent's people became statistics in someone else's spreadsheet. 1 week. That's all it took for Traoré to draw the line. From 11th August to 18th August, a multi-decade scientific endeavor, years in planning, came crashing down. Billions of microbes, millions of dollars, hundreds of scientists. One voice said, enough. But this wasn't the first time Africa had been asked to trust invisible science with irreversible consequences. The release of genetically modified mosquitoes may have been silent, but the reaction it provoked was anything but. Within days of the first batch being let loose, the political temperature in Burkina Faso spiked. Village whispers turned into national debates. Civil society groups raised alarm bells. Farmers, mothers, and local leaders began to question what exactly had been released into their skies, and why no one had fully explained the stakes. What seemed like a minor scientific deployment quickly erupted into a cultural and political flashpoint. At the center of the storm stood President Ibrahim Traoré, flanked not by scientists but by history. His decision to dismantle the target malaria project came not from ignorance, but from a deep recognition of the scars left by similar promises. He did not dismiss science. He rejected silence. He did not oppose innovation. He opposed imposition. And across West Africa, others nodded. Groups like Copagen, a coalition of civil society organizations focused on biosafety, had warned about the exterminator technology long before any mosquito was released. They accused Western institutions of treating African bodies as laboratories. "We are not your guinea pigs," their banners read. In Nigeria, voices like Mariam Bessie echoed the same sentiment. "We will not be lab rats for exterminator technology." Even more striking was the absence of global outcry. No major Western outlet splashed the headlines. No G7 leader made a statement. In the face of one of the most expensive scientific reversals on African soil, the silence was deafening. Why? Because it wasn't just about bugs. It was about power. When African leaders challenge international science, the narrative often flips. They are branded anti-progress, anti-science, paranoid. But Traoré's stance resonated precisely because of the memory it awakened. Africans remember the cotton fields. In 2016, Burkina Faso abandoned BT cotton after quality plummeted and export markets collapsed. They remember genetically modified maize pushed by agribusiness giants, Monsanto, Syngenta, Corteva, and the cycle of debt it birthed. They remember being told this was modernity, while farmers lost seed sovereignty and were forced to repurchase patented seeds every year. And now, the same dynamic was unfolding with mosquitoes. But here's the twist. These mosquitoes were not illegal. They had been approved by Burkina Faso's own biosafety agency, ethics board, and environmental authority. Everything was compliant. And yet, within days, the entire apparatus was dismantled. Why? Perhaps something went wrong in that first week. Perhaps a test result was buried. Perhaps someone realized the cost of proceeding was no longer political. It was existential. Or perhaps Traoré simply listened to the whisper of history. Because this wasn't just science, it was symbolism. Releasing genetically altered organisms into the wild without a full grasp of long-term effects felt like playing God with African lives, and more importantly, with African ecosystems. Mosquitoes, while annoying, are part of a food chain, nourishing bats, birds, fish. Altering them could alter entire ecosystems. Traoré's message was not just to the Gates Foundation. It was to the world. We will not lead the fight against malaria at the cost of our sovereignty. And in doing so, he tapped into a deeper frustration, a sense that Africa, once again, was being offered solutions it did not ask for, from architects it did not elect, using tools it did not build. But mosquitoes were only the beginning, because the same logic that edits DNA can be aimed elsewhere, at seeds, at wombs, even at futures. Long before genetically modified mosquitoes filled the skies, Burkina Faso had already been ground zero for a different kind of genetic gamble, one rooted in its soil. In the early 2000s, the West African nation embraced Bt cotton, a genetically engineered variety promoted for its pest resistance and higher yields. Backed by the likes of Monsanto and again the Gates Foundation, the promise was prosperity through innovation. Cotton, white gold, was not just a crop, it was the backbone of Burkina Faso's economy, accounting for 60% of its export earnings. But within a few years, the dream unraveled. Farmers began reporting poor fiber quality. International buyers grew wary. By 2016, the government made a painful decision: abandon GMO cotton altogether. The losses were staggering. Millions of dollars vanished from global market value. Rural communities that once thrived on cotton exports now bore the brunt of technological overreach. And the damage did not end there. Traditional seeds, adapted over centuries to local climates and ecosystems, were replaced by patented hybrids. These GMO seeds, often protected by international intellectual property laws, forced farmers into annual purchase cycles. Unlike traditional varieties that could be saved and replanted, GMO seeds were legally restricted. The result? A generation of smallholder farmers found themselves paying up to 5 times more for seeds each year, with no guarantee of improved yields. Dependency deepened, sovereignty withered. As if that weren't enough, farmers were also pushed to adopt chemical companions, glyphosate-based herbicides, sold by the very corporations that provided the seeds. What was marketed as a package of empowerment became a cycle of chemical and economic enslavement. This pattern, one of substitution rather than support, repeated itself across sectors. In South Africa, where GMO maize and cotton dominate, more than 85% of maize is genetically engineered. Companies like Syngenta and Corteva control vast swaths of the seed market, and yet hunger persists. Soil fertility declines. Indigenous biodiversity erodes. In Ghana and Nigeria, pesticide imports more than doubled between 2010 and 2020, driven not by local demand, but by the shifting expectations of an agro-industrial model imposed from abroad. Herein lies the deeper consequence. When you tamper with seeds, you tamper with culture. Farming in Africa has never been just about crops. It's been about continuity, identity, survival. GMO-driven models fracture this legacy. So when Ibrahim Traoré dismantled the Mosquito Project, it wasn't an isolated gesture. It was a rejection of a model where Africa is expected to conform, consume, and comply. A model that once cost Burkina Faso its cotton. A model now threatening its ecosystems, its communities, its very right to choose. This is where Ibrahim Traoré's legacy begins to take root, not in fiery speeches or bold headlines, but in the quiet courage to reverse course. In an era when few leaders dare challenge international science and its funders, Traoré's stand marks the reawakening of biological sovereignty. He has reminded the continent, sovereignty is not just about borders. It's about seeds, about systems, about saying no even when the world expects a yes. But what happens when you say no to billion-dollar science? How does the world respond when Africa rewrites the terms of its own survival? When a leader like Ibrahim Traoré defies the tide of global science, the world takes notice, even if it pretends not to. Officially, there was little uproar when Burkina Faso shut down the Target Malaria project. No major outcry from Western governments. No formal condemnation from the consortium's global backers. Instead, there was an eerie silence, one that speaks louder than any press release. But the implications are undeniable. Projects like Target Malaria are not just scientific ventures, they are geopolitical instruments. With over $170 million invested since 2005, more than $155 million from the Gates Foundation alone, They symbolize a form of philanthropic influence that extends beyond charity. It is a soft power mechanism, wrapped in lab coats and global health metrics. And Traoré just broke that narrative. From the outside, the project was about saving lives, but to many across Africa, it represented something else: the enduring perception that Africa is a testing ground, not a partner, where experiments in genetics, agriculture, and medicine begin, not in Paris or Boston, but in Ouagadougou and Kampala. This dissonance is not lost on regional bodies. Organizations like the African Union and ECOWAS have long preached about African-led development. Yet, when it comes to biotechnology, most approvals, funding, and research leadership still flow from the global north. That contradiction is precisely what Burkina Faso has now spotlighted. Who truly drives African science? Even more striking is the role of the United States, both as a silent backer of many philanthropic science efforts and a geopolitical ally of institutions like the Gates Foundation. Through USAID and partnerships with AGRA and other programs, American influence in Africa's agricultural and health sectors is deep and often opaque. But here's where the narrative bends. Burkina Faso's decision is not a retreat from science. It's a call for rebalancing, for research by Africans, for Africans, using African metrics of success, not external expectations. This vision aligns with the emerging blueprint, known as the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a framework still taking shape but already resonating across the Sahel. It's about reclaiming ownership of development pathways, investing in indigenous knowledge, and ensuring that science serves sovereignty, not the other way around. Yet science is only half the story. The deeper question now is, what kind of future will Africa build when it finally controls both the seed and the story? Standing at this crossroads, Burkina Faso offers more than resistance. It offers a roadmap. The dismantling of the Target Malaria Project was not a retreat into isolationism. It was a strategic recalibration, a bold declaration that development, if it is to endure, must be rooted in dignity, not dependency, and that future experiments must serve the people, not overwrite them. In the aftermath of this decision, the real challenge now begins. Burkina Faso must rebuild its scientific framework, not by rejecting technology, but by grounding it in local knowledge, ownership, and context. African universities must be empowered to lead research, not merely execute instructions. Ethics boards must reflect community values, not global agendas. And above all, policies must prioritize sovereignty of choice, the right to say yes, but equally, the right to say no. But this is not a burden Burkina Faso carries alone. Across the continent, similar conversations are unfolding. In Kenya, debates rage over genetically modified maize. In South Africa, farmers demand autonomy over seed selection. In Nigeria, women raise concerns over reproductive control. The undercurrent is clear. Africa is no longer willing to accept imported solutions without scrutiny. Instead, a new generation of leadership is emerging. Leaders who speak not just of growth, but of justice. Leaders who remember. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. And while his decisions may invite criticism from powerful corners of the world, they also invite admiration from the ground up. From farmers who want to reclaim their soil. From mothers who seek safety in medicine. From scientists who want their labs to be places of discovery, not delivery. The road ahead will not be smooth. Rebuilding trust in science, especially after decades of betrayal, is slow work. Developing local capacity takes time. But the alternative, continuing down a path of borrowed blueprints and imposed technologies, is no longer acceptable. This is the moment to ask, what would it look like if Africa designed its future from within, not without? And perhaps This is where the quiet genius of Traoré's act lies, not in what he destroyed, but in what he dared to imagine could be built. Because the true experiment was never in the mosquito, it was in Africa's willingness to say, "This time we choose." In the fields of cotton, in the skies of mosquitoes, in the whispers of women, and the silence of scientists, Africa remembers. This memory is not weakness, it is wisdom. And in choosing to dismantle one of the most expensive scientific projects on African soil, Ibrahim Traoré has reminded the world of something it too often forgets, that sovereignty begins not at the ballot box, but at the body, not in treaties, but in seeds, not in words, but in the right to say no. This is more than a government decision. It is the planting of a new narrative. A narrative where African futures are not coded in foreign labs, but shaped in local councils, community farms, and classrooms filled with questions. The legacy being written here is not anti-science, it is anti-surrender. This is the foundation of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy, a refusal to be experimented on, a determination to build African solutions to African challenges, and a vision where development is a partnership, not a prescription. And that vision stretches forward toward a continent where research is led by African institutions, where farmers control their seeds, where reproductive health is grounded in trust. Toward a horizon many now call the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. But visions need defenders. Legacies need carriers. And so we return to the question at the heart of this story. If Burkina Faso can do this, what's stopping the rest of Africa? Because the future is not waiting for permission. It is already unfolding in every farmer who saves a native seed, in every scientist who questions imported agendas, in every citizen who says, "We remember, we choose differently." And that, too, is part of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. If this story echoes in your soul, do not let it fade. Share it, speak it, and subscribe for the stories that still need to be told.